And we are live.
Good evening. I am Mayor Lovely Warren, and I want to thank you for joining us for our virtual community update, where our staff members provide you, the citizens of Rochester, with an update on city government. Soon you're going to hear from Chris Wagner. He's the director of our Office of Management and Budget. This important office is responsible for the stewardship of the city of Rochester's nearly $530 million budget. This budget supports a wide variety of essential programs and services that directly impact you, from public safety to environmental services, to neighborhood and business support, to our children and families, and the services we provide. Tonight, Chris will talk about how the city of Rochester has been managing its finances throughout this pandemic and the actions we're taking to provide relief to the people who need it most. Chris will also tell you how things are going this year and our preparations for next year's budget, which has a significant gap. We are in uncharted territory. We have never been here before, but I know that we will get through this by working together. Despite our unprecedented challenges, we still need to govern our city. We still need to provide for public safety, keep our streets clear, keep the water running, and keep our refuse and recycling collection going. And that's why it's important for us to hold these virtual community updates so that you know that your city government will continue to not only support and protect you and your families, but also to grow our city to be the very best it can be now and for future generations. So thank you for joining us once again and enjoy tonight's presentation.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Chris Wagner, Budget Director for the city. I'm joined by City Council Finance Chair Malik Evans, City Treasurer Kim Jones, and analysts Sarah Boyce and Emily Lohner from the Office of Management and Budget. Tonight, we will update you on the financial impacts of the pandemic on the city, our response to those impacts, and how we've tried to provide relief to residents, homeowners, and businesses. We will also discuss how things are going in the current budget year and how we're going about planning for next year. As I go through the presentation, there will be a couple of poll questions you'll have the opportunity to respond to. In addition, please submit any questions you may have using your chat feature. We'll have a question and answer session with the panel members at the end of the presentation. One of the first financial impacts of the pandemic we experienced was the reduction in sales tax receipts. The New York State sales tax rate is 4%. The Monroe County sales tax rate is also 4%. We get about 31% of the sales tax collected by the county. Last year, we budgeted $162 million for this revenue. As you can see from this slide, sales tax had performed well for the first 3 quarters of the city's fiscal year, which runs July through June. In each of those quarters, we saw growth over the same period in the prior year. Then in the fourth quarter, we saw a dramatic decline of almost $6 million as many businesses were shut down and people were social distancing. Another significant impact we saw was a reduction in the AIM aid we received from New York State. Aid and incentives to municipalities is aid we get annually from New York State that supports our general fund, the city's largest fund. As you can see from this slide, this aid had been held flat for many years at $88.2 million. In June, which is the end of our fiscal year, the state held back $17.6 million of this aid, as it saw its own revenue streams, including sales tax and personal income tax, declining. Another significant impact we saw was a decline in parking revenue, partly because many people were working from home and partly because of actions the city took. Garage revenue dropped almost $2 million at the end of last year. We currently expect that revenue to continue to be lower this year. Faced with these significant revenue shortfalls, the city needed to take action to protect its finances. I'll walk through now what those actions were. We implemented a hiring freeze for non-essential positions. We locked down discretionary spending, things like travel and training, supplies, and professional services. We implemented furloughs, work share, and layoffs of over 11% of our workforce. I will note that we did so with the additional federal unemployment benefits in mind, so that almost all of those employees were either held harmless or made out better financially during this time. I will also note that what was considered an essential position changed based upon the nature of the circumstances. For instance, even though we closed recreation centers for programming, we didn't furlough the staff because they were essential to the food distribution efforts operating out of the centers. We also took actions to reduce our expenses in the 2021 budget because we expected the financial effects of the pandemic to continue. So we proposed, or the mayor proposed, and city council passed a budget that was $26 million lower than the FY20 budget. I want to remind people as we go along here, if you have questions, please submit them through the chat function. We also identified actions we could take to provide some financial relief to residents, homeowners, and businesses. Those financial relief efforts included pushing back the deadline for paying property taxes, waiving interest and penalties on those taxes, and offering free parking in city garages. We kept financial empowerment centers open for virtual and phone appointments. And through our Department of Neighborhood and Business Development, we distributed CARES Act funding in a variety of ways, including grants and loans to businesses, and provided funds for rental assistance and the prevention of eviction and homelessness. If you go to www.jumpstartingrock.com, you can see additional resources available. Another tool we utilize to help homeowners is the tax payment agreement. I'd like to ask our city treasurer, Kim Jones, to speak on this topic.
Thank you, Chris. Good evening. The city offers city taxpayers the ability to apply for a property tax agreement to cure delinquent property taxes. We hope that this helps take some of the financial burden off of our taxpayers that don't have the ability to pay all of their delinquent taxes all at once. So what the tax agreement does is it affords city taxpayers the ability to take the delinquent taxes and make monthly payments on those delinquent taxes over a maximum of 60 months. So the process is you apply for the agreement, and the tax agreement can actually be obtained off of our website. The web address is listed on the web page. You can print it off of our website, fill it out. You can either return it back to City Hall. We're at 30 Church Street, room 100A. If you don't feel comfortable coming into room 100A, we have a drop box. So as soon as you enter the building, you can drop the agreement off in the drop box. The agreement has to be accompanied by proof of your income. So once we receive that information, we process it through our system. There's another department that we work in conjunction with, our Neighborhood and Business Development Department. They review the application to make sure there are no code violations on the property. For the owner-occupied properties, we do work with the taxpayer. So if you have code violations, we are willing to work with you. For the non-owner occupied properties, you would need to work with our Neighborhood and Business Development Department on some type of an abatement program. So you fill the application out, we'll notify you if it's been approved or not. We ask you to come into the office with a down payment, 10% down payment. And then what we'll do is we'll take those delinquent taxes, we'll basically amortize them over 60 months. So you'll pay a minimum monthly payment for the delinquent amount. And then when the new tax bills are issued, We ask that you just try to keep yourself current. If you do happen to run into financial issues, paying the current tax bill, we'll work with you again on that. So again, you can get the application off of our website. The address is www.cityofrochester.gov/tax agreement. You can drop it off at the drop box if you don't feel comfortable coming into the building. We'll get in touch with you as soon as we get the application and walk you through the process. I just ask that if you do come into the building, that you wear your mask and you practice social distancing. Thank you. I'll turn it back over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Kim. And again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to submit them to the chat function. And that brings us to our first poll question. Rochester Financial Empowerment Center counselors are available to provide free one-on-one financial counseling with individuals either online or over the phone. Would financial counseling be of benefit to you or your family at this time? Please choose yes, no, or maybe by clicking the button on your screen. And while you're doing that, I'll note that you can learn more about the Financial Empowerment Center by going online to www.rochesterfec.org or by calling the number on your screen, 585-252-7110. Again, online at www.rochesterfec.org or by calling 585-252-7110. And now as we wind down the polling questions, Emily, can you share those results? So it looks like about 25% think that the financial empowerment centers might be helpful, and 75% think they won't be helpful. So I guess I encourage you to visit the website to see what services they offer, and you might find them more helpful than you think. So thanks for that, Emily. Moving on to the next slide. We've talked about the initial impact of the pandemic and the city's response. Now I want to touch base on what we're seeing in the current year budget. While we budgeted sales tax $25 million lower than we did last year, we're pleasantly surprised to see that it's actually higher through the first quarter this year by about 1.5%. That's the good news. Unfortunately, statewide sales tax was actually lower by 9.5% for this quarter, which means that New York State revenue is down. So state aid remains a risk for us in the current year. And we won't likely know the impact on our aid until the second half of this fiscal year, which makes planning more challenging. Other actions we're taking are the continued review of all vacant positions, and we've frozen certain discretionary spending as well. As we continue to monitor the current year, we hope for assistance from the federal government, but we continue to plan for the worst. At the same time, we're already planning for next year's budget. Part of that planning includes the city's participation in the Bloomberg What Works Cities Budgeting for Equity and Recovery program. This 15-month program gives us the opportunity to work with 30 other cities to identify strategies to deal with the budget crisis while strengthening our commitment to equity and to develop and implement plans to drive our financial recovery. Through the program, the mayor, the finance director, and I will benefit from the guidance of experts in the public, private, and academic sectors. The city is also participating in the Monroe County Shared Services Panel, looking for new ways to share services and reduce costs. Some existing examples of shared services that have benefited the city and the community are the West Brighton Fire District, 911, and the Public Safety Training Facility. The panel expects to release a plan for public comment in the coming weeks. This slide highlights some of the key timeframes for our annual budget process. we are already updating our gap projection for the next year and will develop some options to close the gap. Departments submit their budget proposals in February. We meet with departments and the mayor in March and April to make decisions on those submissions. The mayor proposes her budget to City Council in May. City Council conducts hearings and votes on the budget in June. Per the charter, the budget is approved in total by department, and any amendments to the budget require City Council action. I'd like to remind you to please submit any questions you have through your chat function. Now I'd like to ask City Council Finance Chair Malik Evans to speak more about City Council's role in the budget process.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for all of you that have joined in on the call. Obviously, for folks who may not know, City Council functions as the legislative branch of city government. And our process is that we have a robust conversation with every single department. Every department is called in for budget hearings over a series of days. It's important to point out this process also includes the Rochester City School District. While the school district is not a department of the city, they are fiscally dependent on the city. And I would point out that the school district has a larger budget than the city. So we are tied together. So their finances are important as well. And that is part of our overall budget process. I think it's important to also point out that statutorily, we have to make sure that we pass a budget within that time frame, and we are not allowed to deficit spend. So we are not like the federal government where we can print money. We are not allowed to print money, which means that we have to make sometimes difficult budget decisions based upon the situations that are at hand. We take into consideration when working to approve a city budget, the needs of the community, feedback that we get from the community, but most importantly, the thing that we have to take into consideration when considering the overall budget is the fiscal reality that is in front of us. Many municipalities around the country have gotten into trouble when they have not lived within their means. So the goal is always to ensure that we are being fiscally responsible while at the same time managing and providing for the basic needs of the city of Rochester. The last thing I'll say, just as an editorial comment, is that from a budget perspective, I'll tell you that I believe that it is very important that the federal government do its part in terms of supporting municipalities during this COVID crisis, because that is one of the ways in which cities like Rochester will be able to not just survive, but thrive. We're going to thrive as a city. We can't be punished for a virus that we didn't create. And we know that, as Chris indicated earlier, sales tax revenue is affected by this. State aid is affected by this. So all those things will have an effect on our budget. And this is why I'm hoping that the federal government will pass a third CARES Act package that will help us meet the needs of all of our city residents. Thanks, Chris, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Malik. And I echo your sentiments about the federal government. It's critical that we get that kind of assistance from them. And hopefully that'll come through. So that brings us to our second poll question. If you're interested in providing input into the budget process this spring, would you rather use an online survey, a virtual online forum, or a telephone town hall? Again, in the past, we've done some in-person meetings in City Hall. We obviously had to get away from that because of the pandemic last year. But again, I'll read these questions again. If you're interested in providing input into the budget process in the spring, would you rather use an online survey, a virtual online forum, or a telephone town hall? And we'll wind down the poll here. Emily, can you share the results? So it looks like 2/3 of you prefer a virtual online forum, and a third of you would prefer the online survey. No takers for the telephone town hall. So this is our first, the budget's first experience with the online forum. So I expect with the pandemic going on, we'll likely do something like this again in the spring. So thanks for taking that poll question. So I've spoken about closing the budget gap, and I just wanted to briefly explain what that term means. A budget gap is basically when future year forecasted expenses exceed revenues. By charter, we must submit a balanced budget where expenses equal revenues. So we take steps to close the gap through expense reductions or revenue increases. A budget deficit is a current year problem where expenses exceed revenues. When we talk about structural budget gaps, we mean that it's not a short-term situation, that the expense base we have exceeds the revenue base. If we don't solve the structural gap, the city will eventually run out of money. Typical drivers of the city's budget gap are benefits, both pension expenditures and medical costs, wage increases, general inflation, capital project needs, and constrained revenues, especially because of the pandemic this year, including New York State AIM, sales tax, and property tax. In addition, we have no flexibility to address the $119.1 million we give to the Rochester City School District. When our budget came out in May, we included a multi-year forecast of expense and revenue. Per that forecast, we initially projected a gap of just under $52 million in the general fund. As I mentioned, we are currently updating those projections to factor in known changes to our assumptions, including an increase in the rate we have to pay into the state pension system for our employees, which is projected to increase our bill by $8 million. We have continued stress on parking revenue, the risk of state aid reductions, and the rate at which we expect sales tax to fully recover. Sales tax is uncertain. Certainly, our gap could grow. We're in a time of great uncertainty. So this brings us to the end of the presentation. We'll now move into the question and answer portion of our program. Sarah, do you have any questions that have come in you can share? Sarah, I can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. First technical difficulty. Our first question is this. What federal funding came in to cover city expenses that were related to COVID? And additionally, did the county provide us with any of its COVID relief funds to help the city of Rochester?
So the city got some CARES funding, and as I mentioned in the presentation, through our Neighborhood and Business Development Department, we distributed most of that funding into the community for a variety of programs, including the ones I mentioned. And so there hasn't been a lot of money, frankly, that has covered city expenses related to the pandemic, and there certainly hasn't been any funding at this point that makes up for the loss of revenue, right, which is the big issue. We are working with the county to potentially share some of their CARES Act funding that they received. And I'm hopeful we'll hear something very soon about that. I know they have a deadline of the end of this calendar year to spend that money. And so I'm hopeful we'll be able to recognize some of that.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Another question we have here is about how our money is spent in our budget. It's over $500 million. Where does that funding go? How much do we spend on police, fire, and other services?
So excluding our payment to the school district, which we really treat as a revenue transfer. And again, that's $119.1 million, which accounts for over 65% of our property tax that we take in. a lot of, as I mentioned, our general fund is our largest fund. And within the general fund, police and environmental services comprise the largest part of that, about 28% each, when you include benefits in those departments. Fire is about 16% of that. And then some of the smaller departments like DRIS, library, NBD, finance, counsel and clerk, some of the back office functions, about 3% each. So that's where our general fund or our budget dollars are primarily spent.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about how we close this budget gap. I've heard that we have a budget gap every year. How have we closed it in the past? And is it really that different this year with some of these challenges?
So, our options are fairly limited. In the past, what we've done is typically a combination of expense reductions and revenue increases. And expense reductions include cuts to planned capital projects or deferring some capital projects. We go out for departments and solicit reductions in efficiencies from the various operating departments. And then we also look for new revenues, grants, and at times we have to increase taxes to make up the gap. We've also used our fund balance at times to help close those gaps, and we've sort of managed throughout the year to try to replenish that. And so we've been pretty successful with that. The most recent year with the pandemic provided significantly greater challenge around that regard in terms of replenishing fund balance because of the revenue shortfall we saw both on sales tax and in our state aid. And this year, as we managed through a lot of uncertainty in the current year, but as we look at the next year's budget, we're looking at a gap that's substantially larger than one that we've dealt with in the past. So it's going to be a challenging 21-22 budget.
Okay, thank you. Another question here is, we've heard a lot about the Rochester City School District finances in the news recently, and we're wondering how that affects the city budget.
So I'm going to start the answer to this question, and I'm going to ask Finance Chair Evans to weigh in on this too, because I know he's got a lot of experience with the school district. I mentioned that we provide the $119.1 million to the district annually, and that affects our property tax revenue. And so it affects how much property tax revenue we can actually apply to city services. Since the district is fiscally dependent on the city, we issue their debt and manage their cash, and their fiscal condition impacts our bond ratings. So, for instance, if the bond rating were lowered based on district finances, which actually happened recently, we could end up paying higher interest rates on our debt. And ultimately, the debt that we issue on their behalf is backed by the full faith and credit of the city. So if at some point the district can't pay, the city's obligated to. So while it doesn't necessarily have a direct budgetary impact, they could have a significant impact on our financial condition. Councilman Evans, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think it's important to know that we're tied at the hip. We are tied at the hip, even though we don't control the district's budget. So their challenges are our challenges, and that's why it's so very important that the school district creates a budget that is accurate and consistent, because if that's not done, that can affect the city. The other thing I'll mention too, and how we're connected and how they're dependent on us and we're dependent on them, is the city actually owns all of the schools, but cannot take possession of a school building unless the district turns that building over. So if they are also dependent upon us for their capital capital improvement plans. We have to provide bonding for those capital improvement plans. So that's important for the district to know, as well as the public. And in doing that, that also gets to their overall fiscal health. That's why it's important that they are healthy from a fiscal standpoint, because it relates to, it can relate to the physical condition of their building. So we also play a role in that. So I think the big piece to remember is that we are tied financially, even though we don't control education in the city. We don't control what books they use, or that type of stuff, the academic side or the management of it. But from a financial perspective, we are tied together. We go together like a horse and carriage, kind of like love and marriage. And it's important to remember that, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Evans. I have one more question here. So if anyone watching has additional questions, please go ahead and submit them via your chat function. What is anything being done to incorporate issues of racial equity into the budget process at this time?
Yes, thanks for that question. Yes, in the current year budget, so the 2021 budget process, we actually, sort of began to incorporate a lot more around the planning for equity. And so each department was asked to consider their current levels of equity in terms of race, gender, disability status in the programs and services that they provide, as well as within their own departmental operations. We also asked them to discuss how they could improve on equity in their own operations and in their own staffing. Several departments also developed racial equity action plans, which are included in the budget book. If you look at the budget book, it's online, sort of right behind the mayor's message. There's a racial equity action plan that discusses what the city's done around racial equity the past year, and those action plans are included there. We also plan to add other departments who didn't submit those plans yet in the 21-22 budget coming up next year. I'll also say, I mentioned during the presentations that we're involved in the Bloomberg What Works Cities budgeting for equity and recovery program. So that program is putting us in touch with, again, 30 other cities in that program, and we're strategizing on ways to analyze impacts of programs and cuts that we might have to make in these difficult fiscal times, and how those things impact equity. And so that's a lens we'll be viewing all of our budget submissions through this year. Councilmember Evans, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, other than that, I know from the city council side, we have been extremely committed to the racial equity work, particularly in the budget, because that's a key piece of our values. We believe that a budget document reflects our values, and the racial equity work is important. We are a part of, through the National League of Cities, a part of the Racial Equity and Leadership Council, and we wanted to make sure that was incorporated in the budget and in each department who came up with their plan, as the budget director said. So that's something that we're committed to, and I believe that it's extremely important that we continue that practice.
Great. Okay, Sarah, do we have any more questions?
All we have for tonight, Chris.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us. And this was our first experience with a virtual online forum for budget. And I want to thank all the panel members for joining us. And as we continue to monitor and what's going on this year and plan for next year, I expect we'll hold another of these to solicit input into our 21-22 budget process. So with that, I'll say goodnight and thank you all for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.